And joining me now to speak about this is a senior program officer at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, Armend Bakaj. Good to have you join us, Armend Bakaj. Now, why has Africa made such tremendous progress when it comes to democracy?
Well, according to the Global State of Democracy report of International IDEA, as you rightly pointed out, there has been a remarkable expansion on democracy in Africa since 1975. That's the year that we have begun measuring democracy on a yearly basis. And this democratic expansion then was particularly boosted in the early 1990s. And the main reason for that is the introduction and the expansion of the multi-party elections all over Africa. If you just look back at 1975, there were only a handful of democracies in the whole of the continent of Africa, whereas in 2018, by the end of 2018, according to our Global State of Democracy indices, almost half of the countries in Africa are democracies. But then within this category of democracies, there are different nuances of democracies. There are weaker democracies and there are more consolidated democracies. And so, to answer your question, one of the main reasons for that is that increasingly elections have become the norm rather than the exception in Africa. Civil liberties such as freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of association and assembly have been particularly have reached particular gains in the continent, and all of this progress has been also boosted by the genuine democratic aspirations of people, of civil society, of youth, particularly in living in more democratic societies in Africa.
All right, but when you look at the year in, year out corruption index, you will see that Africa suffers from some sort of endemic corruption, and that's even countries that have democracy. How can governments in Africa have been made to be more accountable?
Yes, it's according to our Global State of Democracy indices, despite progress made on political systems, on gaining ground with democracy all over the world, and particularly on Africa, unfortunately, corruption is one of those aspects that has not really gotten any better, that hasn't really improved in the last 4.5 decades. If you look back again at 1975, the data that we have for 1975 and the data that we have as of 2018, the absence of corruption or corruption has pretty much remained the same, and that is particularly true of Africa. Africa, together with the Middle East, are the two regions where with the highest levels of corruption. And unfortunately in Africa, the highest share of democracies also, the highest share of countries that are democracies also have high levels of corruption. Advances have nevertheless been noted in some countries, in some particular sub-regions such as West Africa, maybe as of late in countries such as Ethiopia, the Gambia, and so on and so forth.
All right. We also see that elections remain flawed in Africa. And like you rightly know, democracy hangs on free and fair elections. How can institutions and electoral processes be strengthened to curb this trend?
Yes. As I said earlier, elections have now become the norm rather than the exception, and that is pretty much the case for most countries in Africa. However, there are many challenges remaining insofar as the conduct of elections is concerned, insofar as preparations leading to the elections is concerned, and particularly insofar as in the aftermath of elections, what happens after the elections take place. There are challenges, issues such as election-related violence. We've also noted the absence of independence of election management bodies, the political intrusion in the work of election management bodies, the intimidation of voters and opposition parties. These are some of the challenges that are identified in a number of countries all over Africa. So they remain flawed, and in terms of improving them, in terms of what should be done according to our Global State of Democracy report, our emphasis on improving the quality of elections beyond the quality of democracy beyond elections. In other words, not just focusing on what happens on the election day, but also looking at what happens before and after the elections take place. And to do that, we need to focus more on strengthening formal political institutions, of course, but also give an emphasis on strengthening informal institutions, civil society, the media, for instance. These are some of the prerequisites to having a more healthy democracy. In addition to that, we need to deepen democracy through citizen participation in between elections. And in addition, also to strengthen political representation of women and other marginalized groups. By reducing political and social polarization, this is one of the ways that we can ensure to have better elections and stronger democracies, not just on the election day, but before and afterwards.
Armend, because of our time, I just want you to answer this in just a few seconds. We know that some countries are making gains in terms of democracy, but we also see a decline in some other countries. Why do you think that is, and what can be done about that?
Yes. So there are gains that are being identified, but also declines, as you rightly pointed out. Some of the reasons for declines are the issues surrounding democratic backsliding and democratic fragility and democratic weakness. Unfortunately, although, as we said, half of the countries almost in Africa are democracies, we see that a number of them are quite weak. Countries such as Burkina Faso, the Gambia, Kenya, Liberia, Senegal, Madagascar. These are some of the countries that remain weak, and some of the reasons for that relate to corruption, as we noted earlier, relate to the judicial independence or the lack of judicial independence, that being one of the weakest aspects of democracy in Africa.
All right. Senior Program Officer at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, Armend Bakaj, many thanks for your time.